Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on a new series of the SCP channel, which is called Global Talks. We are going to tackle today on two important issues that have been largely debated. One of them is if China could be held responsible for the spread of the virus, and if so, what are the means available for states and persons to seek for compensation. The second issue that we're going to discuss this evening is in relation to the measures that states have taken in their effort to contain the spread of the virus. If these measures are respecting human rights, if some of them are controversial, we have seen that they have been contested at national levels, and some constitutional courts considered some of them as unconstitutional and even as not in line with respecting human rights. About all this with Professor Frederic MEGRET, who is a professor at McGill University. He was Canada Research Chair on the Law of Human Rights and Legal Pluralism from 2006 to 2015. Before joining McGill, he was Associate Professor at the Law Faculty, University of Toronto. He was also a research assistant at European University Institute in Florence. Thank you so much, Professor Megret, for joining us this evening to have a little chat on these issues.
My pleasure, Sorana. Thank you for having me.
So just to set the scene a little bit, I was wondering, what is your view on the current status that we observe at international level? Because apart from the pandemics, we can see a lot of events. And I was wondering if these are influenced by the pandemics in your view, or it's just other events that are basically in peril.
Look, I think that's a good question. I think the best way to look at it is to see the pandemic as being an intensifier of a number of trends that were already there. So in a sense, it's the perfect storm, but it's acting as a revelator of imbalances and problems in the international system. So that really is what we're seeing, and questions that have been asked for at least 20, 30 years about the nature of the international system, cooperation, global institutions, accountability, the resilience of sovereigns, the openness or closeness of borders, questions of racial discrimination within and across countries. All of these questions are being exacerbated by the pandemic. And of course, the pandemic is adding a layer of its own of challenges. These are medical and public health challenges that are new, at least maybe in their dimension, and then considerable economic challenges, but in turn create political commotion and I think are really pushing the fault lines of the relatively open international system that we had had up to then.
I was a little bit surprised to see that there was not as much as international cooperation as I would have expected. It has been declared several times, even before this pandemic, that any health emergency is to be regarded as a threat to all states, and that reactions should be coordinated. And also in 2019, in the World Health Organization, asked states to run different scenarios of pandemics to be sure that they would be ready and that international cooperation would work. What happened? Why is this international cooperation maybe not at the level that we would have expected, and we see this tension?
Look, I mean, I think it's interesting. This is testing some ideas that we have about the international community, and in particular a narrative of progress towards ever greater forms of cooperation and integration internationally. And we had reason before to think that that narrative was limited and in practice hides recurring temptations to go alone. That was obvious. For example, even within the European Union, within the most integrated systems, I mean, Brexit came before, the Greek crisis came before the pandemic. Questions of North-South solidarity, both within and beyond Europe, are being asked all the time. And I think there's a sort of peacetime cooperation and then exceptional time cooperation. In peacetime, states find this is relatively in their interest. In times of extreme pressure, the temptation to go at things nationally and to go down their separate routes is extremely tempting. And it's sometimes tempting to say that this is really what the US does. But even within the European Union, we've seen solidarity tested, as it had, by the way, for at least a decade when it came to welcoming migrants. The financial burden also of following the 2009 crisis. So not entirely unexpected, but Germany and France and other countries have chosen to go down their path to not just close their borders, but occasionally engage in practices, including when it comes to the search for vaccines or the attempt to purchase limited supplies on the international market, to engage in policies that objectively don't favor some of the most vulnerable in Europe or in the international system. So, there's an extent to which international cooperation is, in the best of times, a bit of a pious lie, and it's quite vulnerable to brusque reversals. Obviously, the US has been at the forefront of this in some ways, with very aggressive policies to seize certain supplies. For example, one interesting development, though, is we're seeing a shift in the flows of solidarity and cooperation. So I tend to think of cooperation as traditionally a sort of north-south informed process, but China, for example, has emerged as a big donor, including to some European countries in dealing with the pandemic. Whether that's cooperation or more for sort of unilateral generosity with political strings attached, I think is an open question. But on the more positive front, you see that there's a degree of competition, but also cooperation going on among scientists, right? So when it comes to the medical profession, the need to work together towards solutions is still largely acknowledged, even if states are not really always up to that ideal. And then we have the WHO, which is the one international organization we need in this context, and which has done a fairly good job, not perfect, but has done its best, and is supposed to be a forum for that international cooperation. But in order for it to work as a forum for cooperation, states must heed its warnings, and obviously, we're painfully aware of the fact that it doesn't have any coercive or executive kind of power. It's an organization with a limited mandate, like most international organizations. I think people rediscover on these occasions that international organizations are the furthest thing from world government, despite what some populists would have us think. They're actually quite weak and quite dependent on state will.
Well, WHO has also been criticized and has become a subject of controversy even between states. And even though we see a lot of progress in research and development from a medical perspective, even this has become a subject of controversy between states. So I was wondering, in this context, we even ended up pointing fingers, who to blame who, and who is supposed to take responsibility for the spread of the virus. And here I come to the first subject I wanted to touch upon with you. Do you think that China could be held liable for the way it handled the beginning of this pandemic by not informing in due time the World Health Organization, by not maybe taking certain measures. I even remember at the time I was with ICAO, and there were discussions if there should be indications not to travel to China, or flights from China to be stopped at some point in time, but this was not considered as suitable in the sense that the intention was not to create panic and also not to isolate China from the rest of the world. So in this context, do you think that China could be held responsible for how it handled the situation at the beginning of the pandemic?
Look, it's in a sense the million-dollar question. I think my own inclination about this is to suggest that everything will come in due course, but it's still a bit early in some ways to discuss this. And you know, there's certainly a lot of blame pushing and blame shifting that is used politically to distract attention from the reality of what needs to be done. So personally, even as an international lawyer, this would not be on top of my agenda of things to do. And I think it's also worth underscoring a couple of things in the background, okay? So one is, if there is a Chinese responsibility, then there's also a responsibility of dozens of other major actors on the international stage. So whatever responsibility there is will be shared, and this isn't merely you know, about the trigger and the initial event. It's about how the pandemic was dealt with all along the line. And so I think those who point a finger must think very carefully about how they've dealt with the issue and how these accusations might turn against them. Certainly, there's, you know, we know that the coronavirus, by all accounts, originated in China. That in itself is not particularly decisive. Obviously, you know, viruses have to emerge somewhere, and I think apart from people who argue, and I have no strong views on this, I mean, but you know, but it's man-made. The most plausible scenario seems to be that it's not, and even if it was man-made, I certainly don't believe that it was launched intentionally. So whatever happened, this virus got into the human bloodstream at some point, and but then, you know, all kinds of things went wrong, and currently people in the US in particular are dying, I think, not principally because sometime in January you know, authorities in Wuhan and in Beijing didn't quickly enough alert the WHO. They're dying because the US government has not put in place the best program to deal with the spread of the virus. So, you know, that's one thing, but it's worth stressing that responsibility will be shared, and blame will have to be allotted, I suppose, at some point, and many who blame others will end up being blamed themselves. And so that's one first lesson. The second lesson, I think, is that you know, this idea that in globalization, what happens in one country really can have a ripple effect on many other countries, you know, the sort of the butterfly wing effect, which is, you know, sometimes seen as a bit of an abstraction, I think has now been proved to be very real. And, you know, acts and decisions in China, but also in Europe and in the US and in Brazil and in other places do have consequences for others. And I think that is really an important lesson for the definition of sovereignty. You can no longer say, well, this is an entirely sovereign matter, you know, it's a public health question, you know, we'll address it as best as we want and based on our priorities. In fact, you're creating a negative externality for others potentially, and others are really justified in saying, well, no, wait a minute, what you do affects us. What the US does is not just its business. It now has hundreds of thousands of people who have the virus, and that's going to have an impact on the health of other countries. Potentially, it's going to have an impact on the global economy. The same goes with China. So I think no state is an island unto itself, and so a degree of modesty is involved. And by the way, no amount of good deeds after you've caused harm can, fully compensate for the fact that harm originated in part on your territory. So, China's public relations in that respect are great. I mean, I have nothing against China as a mass producer of surgical masks and all kinds of things that we sorely need. And, it's in that position because we wanted it to be in that position, and because it sort of fought and developed itself to that extent. But now that creates certain responsibilities. And I think, it's worth saying that China has risen to them. China has been, to some extent, quite helpful. Now, if you look at China specifically, right, and, the fact that others are responsible doesn't mean that China can't be. I think...
Can I interrupt you a little bit? When you say others could be responsible and that the responsibility could be shared, what are you having in mind?
Well, I think, there will be litigation within the US, I think, against the current administration, for example, under domestic law, for not acting upon the scientific evidence that they had. And, they won't be able to shift the blame entirely to China. Mistakes were made. So I think there's a whole domestic dimension to this, and we haven't seen the last of it. I mean, if you think of, the 1980s, 1990s, endless trials over contaminated blood by HIV in various European countries, it will take a little while for people to organize themselves, but the litigation will follow, and it will arise on multiple levels. And even though it's not the most urgent thing right now, there's of course no problem fundamentally with seeking to establish responsibilities. That's what we have a legal system for, and people who've suffered and who've lost loved ones should make others accountable. I mean, I should underline that this isn't just a legal issue, it's a political issue as well, and political accountability is very important, often, underestimated. But, for example, not voting into office someone who's probably responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of your fellow nationals, is a good idea and a good way to send a signal that actions have consequences and that people will be held liable. But so when it comes to China, obviously, it's an authoritarian regime and it's not dictatorial. So voting the Chinese Communist Party out of power isn't going to happen. Courts are not independent, so I don't think much will come domestically. But states could complain. They could complain to the WHO. They could think of ways in which China's liability might be engaged. I mean, there's a certain degree of abstraction involved in all of this, right? I mean, I think better decisions could have been made. The idea that China would then be liable for the totality of the results of the pandemic just doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, and it will never happen. So what does one do in such cases? I don't disagree that China could have notified the WHO a little earlier. I think there's always going to be questions about intentionality, negligence, the degree of negligence, and what is the proper standard of care under international law. I don't think China allowed the pandemic to spread in China because it wanted to. I think they, like everyone else, were dealing with a novel threat and thought they had it under control and then didn't. But history shows, the last few months show that other countries did exactly the same mistakes. So everyone was convinced they had everything in place, and the European Union in particular had all kinds of scenarios, etc., and that didn't stop tens of thousands of people from dying. So again, before you blame China, you have to be aware of that. But every single country thought they would be immune from this. And every country that has had that arrogance has then suffered from it.
everybody was watching the news and seeing how Chinese are building hospitals in 1 week time, but nobody thought that they could be touched by the virus, or if they were touched, they would have the appropriate measures. Even Romania, to my mind, took the measures quite late because the virus was already in Europe, but we were just watching the news, hoping that this would not cross our borders. So yes, I do agree with you that the measures and the reactions were pretty much delayed almost everywhere, if I could see. But I do have another question. For example, what if it is being determined somehow that WHO did not give the proper instructions or did not take the appropriate measures in due time, even though it had the information? How would we approach that?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. So, I mean, with the benefit of hindsight, of course, it's always easy to find that a decision wasn't the best decision that could have been taken. I think you have to distinguish between deliberate action, and I don't think there is any real sort of deliberate intention to do harm, negligence, and then simply difficult public policy choices that in retrospect could have been made differently, but where, you know, there were good views on both sides, and the point of politics is you try to make the best decisions in the circumstances, but you can't be held to a sort of unrealistic obligation of results when really these are complex issues. So just maybe flag some of that complexity. When you're managing a pandemic, you don't want to elevate the level of alarm too quickly. There are solid epidemiological reasons for this. You don't want to be sort of Peter the Piper, crying wolf so many times that when you actually do so, no one believes you. You want to make sure, as independent countries have, that the measures that you end up adopting to fight the pandemic don't have perverse effects that are so important that they dwarf the results that you're trying to achieve. You have to deal with a mass of medical and epidemiological data that is arriving in real time, that is contested, that is constantly being debated. You're dealing with different levels of certainty and uncertainty. Now, this isn't to say, I'm not saying the WHO didn't make mistakes. I'm saying, we can't judge the WHO in February by the standards of what we know in July. And so that's an important point. That doesn't mean there shouldn't be lessons learned, as there were after SARS or other coronavirus pandemics, but it just means that legal accountability is not always suited. I think, one of the issues will be, is there a smoking gun, right, at some point? And who knows what the future will disclose. If, of course, pressures from China were shown to have inclined the WHO to minimize the pandemic early on in a significant way, then at the very least we would have a WHO governance and institutional issue and crisis. Whether it would be enough to engage the responsibility of the WHO as an international organization, it's a complex issue, as you know. This is the responsibility of international organizations, of course, is a thing. I would say that one of the main things is for state parties to the WHO to reform it and reinforce it and insulate it further from pressures if pressures are proved to have existed, rather than to have a case against the WHO to make the WHO liable.
Do you think that would be possible with the US being very against WHO and having quite a strong attitude in respect of how WHO managed this crisis? Do you think that the reform of the WHO would be possible let's say that's without US?
Well, it's, you know, this is a bit beyond my expertise, but obviously a lot of things are going to change in the next few months. We may have a new US administration, and if we don't, I think the WHO will continue to be relevant simply because we have no choice but to share information and cooperate internationally. This is by nature a global problem that requires global solutions. And, you know, we're seeing the most populist, border closing, non-cooperative members of the international system are pretty much the ones who've had the worst outbursts of the pandemic. And so I think there's a lesson there that the UK, Brazil, the US are really at the forefront of it in a tremendously negative way. So I think, you know, one of the lessons is we cannot do without international cooperation, and it'll become even more necessary in the future. I think one thing that people have to be open to, though, is that at some point, and this is something we've been suspecting for 2 or 3 decades, dealing with these massive global problems may well require not just more cooperation, but granting more governance powers to these international organizations. So not just reforming them so that they are maybe more accountable or just sort of work better, but actually granting them more powers. And so that is a very crucial step, and it's a step that many states are not willing to take. But it's probably what will be needed. What we've suffered, I mean, one thing that we can see is that countries that have the most consistent, centralized policy when it comes to the pandemic have been quite successful. A place like the US, federal, very decentralized, where every governor, every mayor has a different take on face masks, etc., is a place that creates deep governance fragmentation and problems.
That is true. I do agree with you that there's a lot of fragmentation, even when we talk about smaller states that are not necessarily divided in regions and states like the US. Romania is facing some similar problems. The population itself is divided, and the media is not helping, as the way it approaches the situation, it is more creating panic rather than educating the public. I feel that this is what has been missing throughout this pandemic, a proper education of the public. It has been more a fear infliction than giving at some point in time the right information and making the public understand why they need to take certain measures. You were mentioning earlier that some measures taken by the states could have led to adverse effects. One of these adverse effects is that certain hospitals have been declared COVID hospitals. No other cases could have been treated there, and a lot of patients had to suffer. How is this from a human rights perspective? Could this be seen as inhuman treatment? Who is going to be responsible for people who did not suffer of COVID, but had several other underlying conditions and needed immediate attention, and they didn't have access to treatment?
Look, it's a very important and complex question. As you know, international human rights protects not just the right to health, which includes, you know, access to a minimum and decent health care, but also the right to life, the right to be free from inhuman and degrading treatment, the right to family life, the right to be free from discrimination on racial, ethnic, or religious grounds. All of these rights, not just the right to health, are implicated, and I think there's a role for human rights to play. Now, one thing that is maybe worth pointing is that human rights traditionally has a lot of tolerance for emergencies and the realities of statehood, and in particular some of the measures that states need to take on public health grounds to fight a pandemic. I think where human rights is useful is it will challenge the necessity of those measures. It will challenge the proportionality of these measures, their rationality, the extent to which they were adequately deliberated. And so I think, you know, trade-offs are unfortunately a part in a finite system, a part of the management of any good health system. But and you know, we have many decisions on this. But for example, in South Africa, you know, what is how should states spend their budget? Should they prioritize a few extremely expensive dialysis machines for, you know, just a few people, or with that amount, are they better to invest it in general health prevention to protect a larger part of the population? So my understanding is some of these trade-offs have gone on when it comes to the pandemic, right? We need to protect the population, we need to flatten the curve, and everyone has to be a good soldier and wait for their you know, knee surgery to happen. Now, you know, but governments can also overreact. They could become so obsessive about fighting the pandemic that they would forget their other responsibilities towards patients in need of critical care. To be honest, I think the medical system in many countries, as far as I can see, has been quite rational about these questions. I don't think anyone has gone overboard. People have asked to be patient who needed non-urgent procedures. But, you know, it's a potential angle. And, you know, one thing is, if this lasts 6 months, it's another if this lasts another 5 years, right? Basically what's happening is the pandemic is inflicting huge costs on the populations and asking people to make sacrifices. And the more this drags on, the more these sacrifices will be challenged politically, but also from the human rights angle, right? So is the effort that we're being asked to undertake, including, by the way, in terms of limitation to freedom of expression, the freedom of assembly, right? Are these costs that we're willing as a society to pay? I think what's a bit unfortunate is that the rights discourse has been hijacked sometimes by people who frankly are a bit idiotic and who think that, you know, the main issue is whether the state has the right to impose the wearing of masks. And I think that's a non-issue. So people who invoke human rights when it comes to mask wearing, I think just totally off the mark. There's no doubt that from an international human rights point of view, you can limit rights. It's not even clear to me what right is being limited by the obligation to wear a face mask. There is no human right to walk around without a face mask. And you can still express yourself. You can still do a lot of things, right? So I think that's a huge distraction that people are using human rights in that context when, as you mentioned, there are real and serious issues, right? When it comes to people maybe having to defer, maybe not life-saving surgery, but you know, medical care that is important to them and important to their quality of life and their continued enjoyment. But one of the challenges of the pandemic is we're dealing with uncertainty and risk, right? These are not great for individuals who are waiting, but you know, I think states have to take preventive measures with imperfect access to information. Now, they may overreact. In some ways, it's a case of damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you overreact, people will be upset that they couldn't get their ordinary medical procedure. If you underreact and there's not enough hospital beds for COVID patients, then you also have a problem. So I think, you know, that it's just the fate of the state and governing elites that they have to make these difficult decisions and tend to be faltered either way. I think what's problematic with an overreaction is that the overreaction is maintained over time. But let me just say that on the whole, my impression has been that you know, the bigger problem has been underreaction. I mean, many more people have died as a result of underreaction than overreaction. And, you know, I think most medical systems adjusted as quickly as they could once it turned out that, you know, not as many, you know, beds would be needed. But you have to, you know, bear in mind that there's a certain inertia to these processes, right? So things can't be readjusted in real time, second by second. You know, you can have a decline, and then a week later you have a bump because, you know, some people had a party in a basement somewhere. So things come, so, you know, the medical system can't be constantly, you know, adapting and freeing up beds for non-COVID related medical exigencies. And again, I don't feel that, you know, litigation or human rights bodies here would fault a state unless something really pernicious and sinister had gone on, right? So if it turns out the state had just decided to not bother with people waiting for non-COVID related procedures, and if there was really a significant breakdown in institutional governance, then this might be an issue for human rights. Otherwise, it's just the stuff of uncertainty, politics, and the difficult decisions that we have to deal with when confronted with a problem such as the pandemic.
What about forced hospitalization? We recently had a case in Romania presented in front of the courts with respect to a young girl who was hospitalized by force. Her parents filed a complaint in front of the court, and the court decided that if the family has the appropriate means to make sure that the young lady is properly isolated and they can have access to food without contacting or entering into contact with any other people, then such a measure is illegal, basically. What do you think? Could this forced hospitalization be seen as an infringement of one of the human rights? Maybe you could comment on that.
You know, I think we have to be careful with any forced hospitalization or any forced anything. This is one area where sensitive, you know, human rights are particularly sensitive to. And I think the coronavirus may resurrect authoritarian-leaning legacies in some health systems that have had historically a tradition of, you know, sending people to psychiatric institutions or forcefully committing them to, you know, rehabilitation camps supposed to deal with their health, etc. So, you know, one of the concerns is people are saying maybe we need a Chinese-style top-down authoritarianism to deal with the pandemic because, you know, at least it gets things done. And so there could be a positive reassessment of this form of command and control, quite liberty curtailing approach to dealing with a pandemic. So I think that's, you know, one concern, and then every case has to be examined individually. You know, I think individual freedom comes with responsibilities, and the discourse of human rights is sometimes understood as only a discourse of liberty and freedom that allows people to do everything, when it clearly never was that. There are also state prerogatives and duties to the community and to the collective that are very important. You know, the freedom of everyone stops where the freedom of others begins, and that's the freedom of others to be protected from the coronavirus. But, you know, as long as I think the state is tries to accommodate individual desires and makes sure that individual circumstances are taken into account, then it is not inconceivable that measures involving coercion, you know, not necessarily violence, obviously, but coercion would be ordered.
One last question. Would you consider discrimination based on age, the fact that a lot of states impose very strict rules for people over 65? I do have a very good example, a very close couple, a very good friends of family She was 64 and 9 months, and he was 65. She was able to move around the city, and he was not able to move around the city. But when we talk about risks, she would have had more because of her health conditions. So would this be a discriminatory measure when you target a specific age group?
Sure. Look, I mean, it's an interesting angle. As you know, ageism is increasingly recognized as a form of discrimination of people based on their age, and it concerns particularly the elderly, although sometimes also the young, arguably. But when it comes to the elderly, I think we have to be careful. We have to look at the way in which the pandemic has disproportionately affected older people reflects not just their medical vulnerability to the virus, but also public health and decisions involving older persons that have put them in very vulnerable spots. So I think that's one way of looking at the discriminating element is, why are most victims above 70, and could more have been done to protect them? When it comes to protecting people against, based on their age and limiting their mobility based on their age, I think I have to keep in mind that sometimes human rights allows for a degree of paternalism, protecting people against themselves, and so people might say, well, I'm an adult, I want to do what I want to walk around freely. But the state says, well, you know what, you're actually putting yourself at risk, and you're putting others at risk. So, but when it comes to mobility, and restricting mobility, you're trying to protect certain persons, and then you're trying to limit, for example, the ability of some persons, particularly young persons who are asymptomatic, to spread the virus. And I think you have to be very careful with something that discriminates on age, on the basis of age. But remember, under human rights, you can have differential treatment as long as it's justified by a rational goal that is itself informed by rights consideration. So if you are limiting the rights of mobility of older persons, but in order to maximize their health, and it's based on good, solid scientific data, I think that would probably pass the test. Although there's obviously can always be people who complain, but it's a generic measure and it's insufficiently individualized, and there are 63-year-olds who's in perfect health, whereas some 40-year-old with advanced diabetes maybe is allowed to roam around freely. So, there's always going to be that tension between general measures that are sound on their face and everyone's needs for measures that are individualized and take into account their sort of inherent dignity.
And as a last word, what would be the lessons that we have learned so far? The pandemic is not over. We still have a long way to go. But so far, what would you say that are the lessons we have learned?
I'm not sure if we've learned them, but one lesson that we might learn is humility, right? So that the awesomeness of Mother Nature and the degree to which the best of plans really don't protect us. So our institutions are quite vulnerable. There's a lot of talk, a lot of policies, etc. But it seems that everything is being improvised on the fly with this pandemic, and this really proves that the best laid plans are really not worth much when confronted with the real world challenge. So we'll learn. I think another lesson maybe is that COVID is very helpfully pointing us towards a less carbon intensive society and economy, that many of us are discovering that we can be interviewed on Zoom from Romania to Canada without having to travel and without having to cause further global warming. So that's also, another form of humility in terms of our consumption patterns. And then I think a third lesson is the challenge to the law when it comes to highly complex global crisis. The international system was supposed to be a fairly simple system. We had states responsible within their territory. Every state is responsible for one bit of sort of a global governance function. but we see that that system that we've inherited from centuries really doesn't work anymore. And we've talked about international organizations, but another aspect of all this is corporations. I mean, these days Facebook and Twitter in their own ways are on the front line of fighting disinformation that kills, and sometimes on the front lines of diffusing it and amplifying it, right? So we need everyone in this, and public actors are a very important part, but they can't be answerable for everything.
I would maybe add that it is time to reconsider states' egocentrism. As we have seen, this is something that affects everyone, and it doesn't have borders. So maybe this is something that we could consider for the future. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much.
And I hope to have a chance to speak to you very, very soon again. Thank you so much.
Me too. Thank you very much. Take care.
Take care.